In 1970, a car showed up that was so fast, so dominant, that the sport built for cars like it got scared of it. Within a single year, NASCAR rewrote its own rulebook for one reason only: to make sure this car could never win again. This is the story of the Plymouth Superbird and its twin, the Dodge Charger Daytona. The two cars that were so good, they got themselves banned. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how a grudge, a rocket scientist, and one embarrassed car company built the fastest thing NASCAR had ever seen, and why the sport had no choice but to kill it. If you're into stories where the villain and the hero are the same car, gently tap that like button. Let's get into it. It starts with Dodge getting embarrassed. In 1969, Ford rolled out the Torino Talladega and the Mercury Cyclone. Cars built specifically to slice through air at superspeedway speeds, and they made Dodge's own Charger look clumsy by comparison. The problem was the Charger's grille. It sat recessed into the nose, which meant at 180 miles per hour, it was catching air like a parachute, generating over 1,200 pounds of front-end lift. The car wasn't just slow, it was dangerous, floating and wandering at the exact speeds where control mattered most. Dodge's general manager was blunt about the stakes: keep losing to Ford or fix it. So Chrysler did something almost nobody in Detroit had done before. They didn't hand the problem to a car designer. They pulled in a rocket scientist. His name was John Pointer, and he'd spent his career in Chrysler's missile division before someone handed him a Dodge Charger and told him to make it go faster, no restrictions. Pointer sketched a pointed, air-splitting nose cone on the front and, on the back, an enormous wing mounted almost at roofline height. When Dodge's leadership first saw the design, one executive reportedly called it the ugliest car he'd ever seen in his life. He signed off on it anyway, because the engineers guaranteed it would win. Alongside Pointer, aerodynamicists Gary Romberg and Bob Marcel ran the numbers in rented wind tunnels, one in Wichita using scale clay models, another in Atlanta borrowed from Lockheed, where full-size cars had to be lowered in at a 45-degree angle through a hole built for aircraft. When Romberg and Marcel eventually presented their aerodynamic data to a room of industry engineers, the room was packed, including, sitting in the front rows, aerodynamicists from Ford and GM who'd come to see exactly what Chrysler had built. What they'd built was the Dodge Charger Daytona, and it dropped the car's drag coefficient to 0.28, a number so low that plenty of cars built decades later still couldn't beat it. It debuted in September of 1969 at the Talladega 500, and it won its very first race. But the number that made headlines came a few months later. On March 24, 1970, driver Buddy Baker took a Daytona around the Talladega Oval and hit 200.447 miles per hour. No stock car, ever, had crossed 200 miles per hour. Baker became the first man to do it, and suddenly this ugly experiment wasn't a joke anymore. It was the fastest thing NASCAR had ever certified. Here's the detail that made engineers obsess over this car for decades afterward. That wing, mounted almost 2 feet in the air, looked absurd, and for years, a myth spread that Chrysler put it up that high just so the trunk lid could still open underneath it. It's not true. Pointer himself confirmed the real reason before he died. The wing needed to sit above the turbulent, dirty air rolling off the car's roofline so it could bite into clean air instead. The trunk clearance was a coincidence. Every inch of that car, no matter how strange it looked, was there to solve a physics problem, not a styling one. Now, while Dodge was celebrating, Plymouth had its own crisis, and this one was personal. Richard Petty, the biggest star in NASCAR at the time, drove for Plymouth, and heading into 1969, he begged the company for a winged car of his own to compete with what Ford and now Dodge were building. Plymouth had nothing to offer him. So, Petty did something almost unthinkable for a driver that loyal to one brand. He walked. He left Plymouth and signed with Ford. For Plymouth, this wasn't just a competitive problem anymore. It was an embarrassment, and it planted a very specific goal in every engineer's head heading into 1970. Build something so good, it drags Richard Petty back home. That something was the Plymouth Superbird, and it was built to beat its own sibling. Chrysler took everything learned from a full season of racing the Daytona and pushed it further. The nose was stretched 19 inches longer than a stock Roadrunner. The wing grew to roughly 2 feet tall. And this time, NASCAR's homologation rules had changed against Chrysler on purpose. A year earlier, Dodge only needed to build 500 street versions of the Daytona to make it legal, and they built exactly 503. For the Superbird, NASCAR raised the bar to 1 car for every 2 Plymouth dealers in the country, which meant Plymouth had to build almost 4 times as many, nearly 1,920 of them, just to race 1 car on Sundays. We'll get to exactly how NASCAR finally shut this whole thing down, and there's a strange twist buried in the rule they used. One small race in 1971 that proves the ban wasn't quite what people think it was. But first, you need to see what the Superbird did once it hit the track, because this is where the story gets almost unfair. It worked! Petty came home to Plymouth for the 1970 season, back behind the wheel of a winged car in his signature blue paint. But the biggest statement of the year did not even come from Petty. It came from his teammate, a young driver named Pete Hamilton, who took a Superbird to victory in the Daytona 500 and then went on to sweep both races at Talladega that same season. 2 of NASCAR's biggest superspeedway crowns, both won by a car that had existed for less than a year. And here is the number that made the Superbird almost impossible to argue with. Its drag coefficient matched the Daytona's at 0.28, a figure that, again, most cars still cannot touch today. On the 426 Hemi version, 0 to 60 came in around 4.8 seconds, quick even by modern standards, let alone 1970. Only 135 Superbirds ever got that Hemi engine. The other roughly 1,800 ran a 440 cubic inch V8 in either a 6-barrel or 4-barrel setup. And there is an odd little wrinkle here that even hardcore Mopar fans forget. In a straight line quarter mile, at normal street speeds, a regular Roadrunner without any of the Aero parts was actually just as quick as the Superbird, sometimes quicker. The nose and wing added weight and did nothing for the car until it crossed roughly 60 to 100 miles an hour. Below that speed, all that engineering was dead weight. Above it, the Superbird became something no other car on the grid could touch. It was a machine built entirely for one very specific, very extreme situation. And when that situation showed up, on a super speedway at 190 to 200 miles an hour, nothing else in NASCAR could live with it. That's exactly the kind of dominance that gets a sport's attention, and not in a good way. By the end of the 1970 season, NASCAR had a real problem on its hands. Between the Daytona and the Superbird, Chrysler's winged cars had turned superspeedway races into a formality. Tire technology and brake technology from 1970 were never designed to handle cars sustaining north of 190 miles per hour for 500 miles at a time, and officials were genuinely worried about safety at those speeds. But there was another, quieter issue too: competitive balance. Ford and Mercury had tried their own Aero cars, and none of them matched what Chrysler had engineered. NASCAR was staring at a future where every superspeedway race was decided before the green flag dropped just by who was driving a winged Mopar. So, for the 1971 season, NASCAR made its move, and it's a masterclass in how a sanctioning body kills a car without technically banning it. Instead of outlawing the Daytona or the Superbird by name, NASCAR simply announced that any car using that aerodynamic body style would be restricted to a 305 cubic inch engine, less than half the displacement of the 426 Hemi that had made these cars legends. On paper, the Superbird and Daytona were still legal. In reality, gutting the engine like that made them completely uncompetitive. easy prey for any ordinary stock car with a full-size motor. It was, in effect, a death sentence written in a footnote instead of a headline. And here's that twist I mentioned earlier. NASCAR's rule was so cleverly worded that one single 305 cubic inch Daytona actually did show up and race at the 1971 Daytona 500, technically proving the car was never literally illegal. It just proved the opposite point even harder. Stripped the engine down to meet the new rule, and the car that had terrorized NASCAR a year earlier couldn't even keep pace with the field. Chrysler didn't bother building another one. The winged car era, which had lasted less than 2 full seasons, was over. Quick break, because if you're the kind of person who wants the full breakdown of the engineering, the wind tunnel data, and the rest of NASCAR's Aero wars beyond just these 2 cars, that's exactly the kind of deep dive I put together regularly. Check the description and the pinned comment for more on that. Now, back to how this story actually ends, because the ending is the strangest part of all. You'd think a car this dominant would have sold out instantly. It didn't. The Superbird's looks were simply too extreme for most buyers in 1970, and Plymouth had built nearly 1,935 of them to satisfy that homologation rule. Many sat unsold on dealer lots for close to 2 years, and some dealers got so desperate they stripped the wings and nose cones off and sold them as regular roadrunners just to move inventory. Think about that for a second. The single fastest, most feared stock car in America was, at the exact same moment, a car nobody wanted to park in their driveway. That's the twist that gives this story its real ending. The Superbird and the Daytona didn't lose because they were beaten on a racetrack. They lost because they were too good at the one specific job they were built for. And that success is precisely what forced the sport that created them to write the rule that killed them. Today, the story has completely flipped. Original Superbirds now sell for anywhere between $200,000 and $450,000. And the cars that sat ignored on dealer lots in 1972 are some of the most valuable American muscle cars ever built. NASCAR wrote a rule to erase them from competition, and instead it turned them into legends. Sometimes the fastest way to become immortal in this sport isn't winning forever. It's winning so hard that someone has to stop you.